All right, it is 7:30. It was 7:30 at least a few minutes ago on a beautiful balmy Monday here in Salt Lake City. And it is my pleasure to welcome you one last and final time to Journey of the Soul. Tonight we are at lesson 6, which is entitled Life is Short-ish. I must tell you, in preparing tonight's class, I was actually quite enthused. Tonight is going to be a little bit of a Farbrengen, a little bit of an enjoyable gathering together where we are going to kick around some ideas that are really the sum total of everything we've discussed until now. Tonight really is kind of the capstone discussion, excuse me, bringing together all the different conversations we've had over the past 5 weeks. We're not really going to talk about any earth-shattering new ideas tonight. Tonight we're going to have a pep talk of sorts, reinforcing certain ideas based on the philosophies that have been shared over the past 5 weeks. I must tell you, I'm feeling exceptionally positive today and cheerful about life. Earlier today, I received my first vaccine. I received the first Moderna shot. I was also told, just as a word of caution, if in the middle of class I start mumbling in Russian, it's a very common side effect. So please do not be concerned. Everything is just fine. I was told that spurts of the Russian language are a common side effect. Я понимаю, я по-русски, очень важно, nothing to be concerned about. This is just kind of, I guess, the reality of living in a pandemic world. 5 weeks ago tonight, we began a journey. We embarked together on a journey so aptly called Journey of the Soul. And as we talked about, as I sat in this very chair, actually 5 weeks ago, I was still standing at the podium. But as I told you 5 weeks ago tonight, although this was called the Journey of the Soul and it was going to be a class which was ostensibly about death and the afterlife, the reality is that during this class, we would have the ability to impact and perhaps even redefine our time here in this world. And as I promised you 5 weeks ago, learning a little bit about death and the afterlife might actually, and hopefully indeed actually, did give us more of an appreciation for the life that we live in this world. And hopefully I wish each and every one of you for many long, happy, and healthy years. So I actually want to start tonight's class taking your temperature on something. Page 210 in the student book, exercise 6.1, you have almost completed the journey into Judaism's approach to death, afterlife, and reincarnation. Take a moment to identify 3 ways that the perspectives we gain can influence one's life and its daily realities. I'm content if you want to give me one way, but I'm curious, after having taken the class now for 5 weeks and having gone through everything that we have gone through together, share with me a perspective of yours that has been affected as a result of the discussions that we have had. Feel free to unmute yourself or chat at us, whichever is more preferable for you. Tell me something that has changed about your life now that you have learned a little bit more about the journey of the soul. I see Richard and Steve are unmuted. I'm not sure if that's because they just joined. They got something to say. Richard, tell us something you gained during class.
I am unmuted.
We'll come back to you. You're good. We want you to be unmuted. Anybody else want to either unmute or chat at us? What is a new perspective you have gained about life in a class about death? Steve.
I have never thought about the journey of the soul. That whole concept, that whole story, I just had never thought about that.
Lovely. I hope that thinking about it has given you some comfort and not the lack thereof. Jay says he's more aware that his mitzvot benefit my ancestors. That's beautiful, Jay. I'm glad that you got that. That's undoubtedly something which we want to bring about. Cheryl, go ahead.
That when you lose somebody, originally I thought this is so terrible because they don't have the ability to do this anymore or that anymore or see this anymore or see that anymore. And now I know that perhaps they do more and even see more than I can possibly imagine.
I love that. Thank you, Cheryl. That was profound. Laura has chatted at us. Laura says the class has reaffirmed my strong positive conviction about cremation as well as the recycling of a person's soul. Good, Laura. I'm glad that you came out of this with your convictions reaffirmed, and that's excellent. John says, I have a new look on life, realizing what will happen to the soul afterwards. Good. Excellent. Anybody else before we move on? Okay. In the first lesson of this course, taught approximately 5 weeks ago, we spoke about the fear of death. We spoke about that new phobia that we had talked about a little bit, and we spoke about the fact that the natural and humanly instinctive fear of death is mitigated by the Jewish perspective on life and death. And we realize the fact that if we grasp the notion that the real me is eternal, and in fact, the real me goes back to its place where it experiences great pleasure, that would hopefully calm and allay our fears about death. So to recap what we kind of talked about in lesson one, number one, we clarify that the soul is the real me, and thus it is eternal. Number two, we qualify that the body is just a temporary container for the soul, and the soul very easily jumps from one stage to the other. And third of all, we talked about the idea that the soul experiences great pleasure when it is back in its native habitat. One of the questions that I think we had the ability to really grapple with and understand throughout the process of the course is one that I think we began with 5 weeks ago. Certainly I began with, and I think it's given me tremendous new perspective on the idea. Why is thinking about death crucial to living a life of meaning? And that is really the question that I want to talk a little bit about as we move through tonight's class. In the beginning of tonight's class, why is it that having a healthy perspective of death, which is something I hope you have all gained over the past 5 weeks, why is having a healthy perspective about death crucial to living a life of meaning? And I think that this question that's up here on the board, it warrants clarification, because when some people think about death, they have panic attacks. When some people obsess about death, it leads them to a place of great anxiety and sadness and depression and what have you. When we speak about thinking about death, I want to qualify that we're talking about thinking about death through the context of this class and hopefully having a healthy and safe perspective when thinking about death. But I think the question that we want to ask ourselves, now that we have the ability to look at death in the appropriate perspective, which we've gained in lessons 1 through 5, why is it that thinking about death is indeed crucial, to living a life of meaning? And we're going to actually entertain some of those ideas right now. We have a friend here in class today, Damien. Damien is very big in the tech scene, and so I had never heard of this app until tonight. Maybe Damien did. He's more plugged into the tech scene than I am. Interestingly enough, in 2018, there was an app that took off. It was called WeCroak. WeCroak has to date over 5 million downloads. What does WeCroak do? Excuse me, it's a tongue twister. WeCroak will remind you 5 times a day that you are going to die. They will send you a pop-up to your phone 5 times a day that you are going to die. If you take a look at it, they send it in very eloquent fashion. Don't forget, you're going to die. Swipe to see the quote. The notion that WeCroak is based off of is that instead of receiving WhatsApp notifications, pop-up notifications, app notifications on your phone saying, look at this fantastic idea, which might tell you why you're going to win the lottery. Look at this inspiring quote, which will tell you why you are going to be the next Olympic gold medalist, which, let's face it, most of us are probably neither going to win lotteries nor be Olympic gold medalists. WeCroak took a very, very different approach to life. If we remind people that death is perfectly normal, perfectly healthy, in fact, every single person who is reading this app notification ostensibly is going to die at some point. If we put people in a frame of mind where they can have a healthy appreciation for the concept of death, they will be a lot better off than wondering when they're finally going to win their Olympic gold medal. And so indeed today, WeCroak has over 5 million downloads, which reinforces to us the idea, the notion that we talked about earlier when we asked the question, thinking about death is crucial to living a life of meaning. Really, the question is, why is that? Does anybody have any thoughts before we delve into the text? Does anybody want to share why is it indeed that living a life where having a healthy perspective of death is crucial to actually living a life of meaning? Any thoughts? Okay, well, let's jump into it. Oh, I'm sorry, Kira, did you just come in or do you have a thought you want to share?
Oh, I just entered.
Kira, good evening, it's good to see you. Okay. Earlier in this course, actually in the famous lesson 1, we talked a little bit about the terror management theory, people coming to grips with some of their greatest fears. Recently, modern psychologists have discovered that having a healthy and appropriate perspective on death is actually crucial to living a very productive life. Let's read text 1 together. taken from a medicine journal, which discusses this very idea, page 211 in your textbook. There is no exercise or reflection as potent, perhaps, as contacting one's ending. In confronting our own passing, we are better able and more willing to help others see the power of awareness of that which is inevitable, death, helping us to wake up to the tender colors of life and personal creation. In contemplating our own end, we recognize that there is still time for life in whatever time is left. Values are there to be lived until the last inevitable moment. To acknowledge this is freeing. To acknowledge this is freeing. By contemplating our own end, we give ourselves a liberty that otherwise we would not have. To acknowledge this is freeing. Interestingly, this is not just something which comes about from modern psychology. This is actually an idea which is expressed in the Torah, taken actually from a fascinating verse in Psalms, which is thus elucidated in the pages of the Talmud. And the verse in Psalms, text 2a, Psalms chapter 4, verse 5 says the following: "Be agitated and do not sin. Verbalize within your hearts upon your beds and be forever silent." Now, I don't know if any of you have ever opened up a book of Psalms and looked at the English side, but suffice it to say that King David was quite the poet. And many of the things he writes don't exactly jump off the page with sense. They could be puzzling, they could be mysterious, they're very poetic. That's why it's Psalms. So the Talmud in the Tractate of Brachot, page 5, folio A, and text 2b in your book, expounds the verse as follows: "We should always agitate our good inclination against our evil inclination. As it is stated, be agitated and do not sin. If this vanquishes the evil inclination, all is good. But if not, we should occupy ourselves with Torah study. As it is stated, verbalize Torah teachings until they enter within your hearts. If this vanquishes it, all is good. But if not, we should recite the Shema, as it is stated, upon your beds. If this vanquishes it, all is good. But if not, we should remind ourselves of the day of death, as it is stated, and be forever silent." According to the Talmud, what King David is trying to convey to us in the book of Psalms, chapter 4, is that the greatest asset that we have to utilize in our life of divine service, the greatest asset that we have to maintain perspective on what is important in life, and frankly, what is not, is a healthy perspective of our own mortality. The greatest asset that we can call to stand by our sides in a time of need, to agitate the evil inclination, to make the right decision and do what is moral and correct and appropriate, is a healthy perspective of death. Which really brings us, I think, between the texts 1, 2a, and 2b that we discussed, really brings us to the benefits of contemplating our mortality. And I want to put them up here on the board and discuss them for a moment before we watch tonight's fascinating lesson video. I think, number one, a healthy perspective of death, of our mortality, allows us to prioritize and retain focus. It helps us really keep in perspective what is important and what is not important. And tonight we're going to learn a little bit about that in some of the texts we're going to delve into. We're going to see that certain people lose focus. Their focus gets shifted as to what are real priorities in their life, and oftentimes it's death and mortality and the end of the journey that allows them to really retain that focus. Number two, if we have a healthy perspective on the fact that everything which we do is ultimately limited, I think it helps us avoid foolish mistakes. Again, it helps us stay focused, and if we're going to be focused, then we're going to avoid making petty and inappropriate decisions. If we live a life where we realize that ultimately all of us one day are going to be called back on high, and we don't know when that moment is. We know plenty of people that God has decided it was their soul's mission to live in this world for dozens and dozens of years and live a long and long productive life. Well, there's that. There are other people who God has decided that it was their turn to not live dozens of years, to live a short and productive life. If we have a healthy mentality of that, it allows us to seize and embrace every moment. Which, if we're seizing and embracing every moment, if we are utilizing every opportunity we have to live life to the fullest, undoubtedly someone who embraces every passing moment as something which is never coming back, it will allow us to live life more fully. And in a certain point, if we realize that at the end of the day, we were given here a mission, the reason we were put here on this earth is to do certain things, is to fulfill a godly mission, ultimately our life becomes more meaningful and not just functional. As we talked about earlier in class, ultimately, everything which we have discussed in this course is something which we take from a book. There is nobody, to the best of our knowledge, that has ever lived, died in all eternity, in all perpetuity. We're not talking about having a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience, but lived, died, and gone on to the next world and come back to tell us what it's like in the next world, to give us counsel for how we should live our lives in this world. However, as we're going to see now in tonight's lesson video, there is a fascinating story about a man who almost did that, and how that experience that he had drastically changed the way he viewed and had his perspective on life, and ultimately how he used his experiences to change the way the entire world has a perspective on life. I hope you enjoyed this.
Dynamite, from the ancient Greek term for power, is a potent material indeed. But a person can hardly encounter a more powerful motivator to plan for his day of death than the opportunity to read his own obituary in the media. Alfred Nobel was a 19th century Swedish chemist and engineer with 350 different patents. He owned 90 factories that manufactured armaments and was the inventor of dynamite. His brothers Ludwig and Robert Nobel were tycoons with oil fields along the Caspian Sea. Alfred invested in his brother's enterprise, and he grew ever wealthier. Then, in 1888, Ludwig Nobel died suddenly while on a visit to Cannes, France. The passing of one of the Nobel magnates was exceptionally newsworthy. In their haste to hammer out the headlines, the French newspapers misidentified the deceased, mistakenly reporting that Alfred Nobel had died. Alfred was shocked to read of his own passing. He was deeply disturbed at the far from flattering obituaries. Bold black headlines screamed, "The Merchant of Death is dead." The fine print was no better. Dr. Alfred Nobel, who became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before, died yesterday. Alfred was sobered by an experience afforded few. Is this how I will be remembered when my time comes, he wondered? Will I be forever tainted as the Merchant of Death? Historians speculate that Alfred, determined to improve his genuine obituary by improving his lasting effect on humanity, took steps while still hale and hearty to ensure that mankind would remember him as an everlasting contributor to the advance of civilization and quality of life. On November 27, 1895, Alfred Nobel signed his last will and testament, designating 94% of his vast fortune to the creation of the Nobel Prizes. To this day, his name is synonymous with the advance of science, medicine, literature, and world peace. All it took to transform a merchant of death into an angel of progress and peace was a moment of serious reflection on mortality and its consequences.
As a rabbi who deals primarily with young people, and I think there's one person on tonight's class who really fits into the category of the people that I deal with. So Kira, please do not take this as an indictment of all young people. I myself am a young person relatively, but if there's one notion that is very prevalent with the young people that I deal with, it's the idea of YOLO, right? How many times have we heard that from someone younger? And to be guilty, I say the same thing plenty of times. There's an idea of YOLO in our generation. Yes, does anybody here who's not from my generation actually know what YOLO stands for? Raise your hand if you know what YOLO stands for. I'm getting a lot of blank stares out there. Who knows? Jen knows what YOLO stands for. Does anybody else know what is YOLO? Kira, tell us what YOLO stands for.
You only live once.
Only live once. How many times have I heard from someone, "Hey, Josh, I missed you for the past couple of weeks. Where were you?" "Rabbi, I was rappelling down Niagara Falls in a water barrel." Why? Rabbi, YOLO, baby. You only live once. And And you know, I've never really had a conversation with someone where I've gotten down to the sentiment of the depth of YOLO. But to me, YOLO has the following connotation. Look, we're all going to die, right? It happens to everyone. You only live once. If we're all going to die, we may as well make this life more worth it. And so, seeing as we're all going to die, whether I die tomorrow going down Niagara Falls in a water barrel, or I die at 95 in a hospital, YOLO, I'm going to end up dying anyway. So, may as well live up the one life that I have. I think what's been so powerful about this course is that we have learned that YOLO is very much not true. And I think we talked a little bit about that idea, the story of the sixth Chabad Rebbe who was threatened with a gun and told the guard that was threatening him that this is a machine that scares people that have one world and two gods. But seeing as I have one God and two worlds, I don't YOLO. Y-O-L-T, I yolt. I only live twice. I live in this world and I live in the next world. And so therefore my choices are guided by a very different compass than yours. And I think as we think about it, that was Alfred Nobel's wake-up call, which, as we mentioned, most people don't have, thankfully. Most of us don't get to see our own obituary. You know, it's interesting. We talked about the fact, I think it was in lesson 3, that the last thing that we're judged on is what is said about us at our Shiva house. It's actually brought down in the Medrash that the last thing that a person is judged on is their tombstone. A person's tombstone is the last piece of evidence presented at the heavenly court, which determines where they should go. We don't have the opportunity to read or write our tombstones. We don't have the opportunity to participate in our own shivas. But if we were to have the idea that Alfred Nobel had, Alfred Nobel was probably the first person that said, not YOLO, YOLT. You only live twice. I'm a little bit concerned what they're saying about me when I leave behind this first world. So I'm going to make an impact so that as I transition to the next world and I realize that what my role will be in the next world, good things will said about me, and I can be sure I'm leaving behind a positive impact. Before we continue, as we go down this idea of kind of hammering home the different powerful sentiments that were expressed in tonight's class, I think you might very much enjoy this week's meditation.
For our meditation reflection for this final lesson of the Journey of the Soul course, we're going to take a meditation straight from our sages, from Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, which tells us to meditate upon 3 things. Imagine, if you will, that there's an eye that sees, an ear that hears, and all of your deeds are written in a book. Now, that's something that for centuries would have taken imagination. But in our day and age, it doesn't take any imagination at all, because we know that everything is seen, heard, and recorded. What we're going to do now is imagining ourselves at the end of our lives in the editing room, so to speak, with all the footage, all of the film, all of the recordings, every moment of our lives. It's there for review, to rewatch, to relive. Imagine yourself now looking back through your life, watching the real-time movie of every single second. See yourself in every place where you've been, every person you've ever met, even if you pass them in an elevator for 5 seconds. And now, let's start to edit and form our highlight film. And of course, what does a highlight film mean? Now that the soul has left the body, the highlights are not which restaurants I ate at or where I went on vacation. The soul now has moved on from a body. The highlights are, what good did I do in this world? Who did I love? Who did I help? Start to imagine your life. Start to reflect on the real highlight film. Those small fleeting moments that were over in seconds, but last forever Who did you affect? Who did you help? How did you make the world a better place? And now realize that we're not editing just yet. We're still filming. We're still making the movie. Imagine yourself now, you're still filming the movie. Visualize it. You're in the director's chair. What scene will you direct? Take a moment to visualize and reflect.
As a segue from that meditation into the next portion of class, they tell the joke about Beryl, shopkeeper. The guy had worked in his store probably for 72 years, 95 years old. He's laying on his deathbed. He couldn't see, but he could still hear. He senses the end is near. And he says, Moshe, are you there? Yes, Father. Yes, I'm here. What about Zalman? Zalman, are you there? Yes, Papa. Papa, I'm right over here. And how about David? David, are you here? Dad, I'm right behind you. I'm over here. And Sarah, is Sarah here? Father, I'm right here. We're all right here. Aha. So if all four of you are sitting here, who's running the store? There's the famous Jewish proverb. It's actually quoted, it's attributed to Reb Shimon Frankfurter, who was an 18th century leader in old Europe. It's turned into a very catchy Jewish song. But it goes as follows. Text 3 on page 215. Folks fret over a lost dime and fail to fret over lost time. But money provides no reprieve, while time is impossible to retrieve. There's the famous Jack Benny clip. I'm not sure if you've all seen it. It's definitely on YouTube, where Jack Benny was once met in a dark alley by a man with a gun. And the guy says, your money or your life? Jack says, I got to think that over. Ultimately, if I gave you all a choice, a very simple ultimatum, you could either waste an entire day, meaning there would be a day expunged from your record. You would go to sleep tonight on Monday and you would wake up on Wednesday. A day would be gone. Or you'd have to pay me $1,000. What would you choose? Some of you will say, hang on a second. Can I pay you the $1,000 and have a day to lay in bed and do nothing instead of having the day expunged from my record? Yes, if that's how you choose, no problem. But think about this for a second. If you had the opportunity to either lose a day or lose 1,000 American dollars, what would you choose? Let's get some input from the crowd. What would you choose? A day or a grand? What is more precious to you ultimately? Your time or your money? Chat at me or come off mute. Time or your money, folks? What are we thinking? John says I can never get the day back. Okay. Anybody else? Time or money? Time, says Laura. Time, says Jill. A day, says Kira. Okay. I think we have reached some level of consensus. Well, I'm glad to hear that we all have those priorities. It's interesting to think that humanity, if you were to ask most of humanity that question, I think we'd get all the same answers that we're getting tonight. But isn't it unique how few people actually live their life in that way? There's a remarkable medrash that I want to share with you now in text form on page 216. If not for our fear of the angel of death, what wrongs we would commit against our Father in heaven. Let us learn from the first 10 generations of humanity God showered them with abundant paradise-like goodness, including centuries-long lifespans. Yet they were on the brink of destroying the world. There was one group of people in our history that lived for an eternally long time. Those were the first 10 generations of humanity. You look through the first few chapters of Genesis, one lived for 777 years, and one lived 916, and one did 987, and one did 943, and on and on and on. They lived for a very, very long time. It was those generations, those first 10 generations of humanity, that denigrated the world to such an extent that it was after those 10 generations that God wanted to bring about a flood and ultimately destroy the entire world. Earlier tonight, we spoke about the benefits of contemplating our mortality. Tonight, now, we're going to speak about the flip side of that coin, the consequences of avoiding our mortality. The consequences of realizing, or failing to realize, I should say, that every single day we have is so measured and so precious, and as such, should be treasured and treated accordingly. If we avoid our own mortality, if we think that we will be here forever, our sole focus is going to be on selfish desires and aspirations. If I'm going to be here forever, and ultimately that is the bulk of my existence, I may as well make myself comfortable in the time that I'm going to be here on this earth. Furthermore, if I'm going to live 200 years, let's leave 900 out of it for a second. If I'm going to live to be 200 odd years old, how many days is in 200 years? 200 years is roughly over 7 million days. I could waste a couple and do absolutely nothing, not be a productive member of society, because, hey, the end is never coming. Furthermore, if I can get done tomorrow what I can get done today, and I can certainly get done after tomorrow's tomorrow what I can get done today, why should I feel any sort of urgency to do anything in any sort of punctual fashion? I've got all day to do. If I'm going to be obsessed with the fact that I'm going to live forever, and ultimately that's where it's at, that's the point of everything, I'm completely cut off. There's no connection to what life is truly about. And lastly, the inability to realize that every day is precious and every day is another opportunity to fulfill our mission really distracts us from what we were put down here on this earth to do. This is a nice idea. This is something which we can speak about in hypothetical terms and contrast ourselves with those that came before us that lived for centuries and centuries. But let's see this in the very, very profound words of an 18-year-old whose name was Miles Levin. Let's take a look together on page 217, text number 5. Miles Levin, when he was 16 years old in June of 2005, was diagnosed with a very rare pediatric cancer. He was given about 6 months to live. Ultimately, he lived for just a little bit longer than 2 years, and he passed in August of 2007, 6 days before his 19th birthday. Shortly after he was diagnosed, this was in 2005, when the internet was a raging invention, he began to blog and he began to post daily about his thought processes as he was living really a numbered life. Text 5. I went to the driving range the other day and I was thinking how you start out with a big bucket of golf balls and you just start hitting away carelessly. You have dozens of them. Each individual ball means nothing. So you just hit, hit, hit. One ball gone is practically inconsequential when subtracted from your bottomless bucket. There are no practice swings or technique reevaluations after a bad shot because so many more tries remain. Yet eventually you have to reach down towards the bottom of the bucket to scavenge for another shot, and you realize that tries are running out. Now with just a handful left, each swing becomes more meaningful. The right technique becomes more crucial, so between each shot you take a couple practice swings and a few deep breaths. There's a very strong need to end on a good note. Even if every preceding shot was horrible, getting it right at the end means a lot. You know, as you tee up your last ball, this is my final shot. I want to crush this with perfection. I must make this count. Limited quantities or limited time brings a new precious value and significance to anything you do. Live every day shooting as if it's your last shot. I know I have to. I found out today that 5-year survival rates are just 30%. Ultimately, this young man passed away 2 years after this blog post was written, which was actually significantly more time than he was given initially, but it really gave him an appreciation for the end of days. On a personal note, I remember exactly where I was standing when my grandfather, who was just days short of his 70th birthday, was diagnosed with a glioblastoma, was diagnosed with a terminal brain tumor, brain cancer. And he was put on the clock. He was given a certain amount of months left to live. And there's something fascinating about that, because this is a man who was 70. And even before his brain cancer, I wouldn't say he was in the greatest of shape. And we all know that 70-year-old grandparents aren't going to live forever, but they're going to live for a while. They're going to live for, 10 years, 15 years, maybe 20 years. And knowing that he had months left to live, ultimately he would live 3 years after this diagnosis, but knowing that he had months or even a short amount of years left to live puts everything into perspective. Things that need to be said now. Sentiments that need to be shared now. When we have a healthy perspective of our mortality, we begin to realize something very profound. And that is that life is too short to waste. I want to actually ask you all to join me, please, on exercise 6.3 on page 218. Allowing yourself a moment to contemplate between each response. Record 5, and heck, I'll even give you 1, however many you feel comfortable. Record 5 meaningful endings to the following statement. Life is too short to whatever it is. I'm going to give you the opportunity to write these down in your book. If you want to share them with the rest of the class, we would love to hear them. I understand it could be a very private sentiment that you want to share, but if you're comfortable, feel free to come on mic or put in the chat box. Esther says waste with the wrong friends. Oh, I'm sorry, Laura had a comment about procrastination. A very good one, I'd say. But feel free to either chat over here. Damien says too short to waste time. Anybody else want to share it? Jen, worry about things that haven't even happened yet. I like that. I like that a lot. Esther says pursue materialism. Love my family as much as I would like to. Beautiful. Go ahead,
Life is too short to be life is too short to be selfish.
Life is too short to be selfish. Excellent. Anybody else? Not to enjoy it. John, always a man after my own heart. Esther says, speak or think ill of yourself or others. Beautiful, ladies and gentlemen. Beautiful. Anybody else? Life is too short to ignore what's most important. Thank you, Dr. Spector. Lovely, lovely. And again, I'll state the obvious here because I think this is something which bears repeating. Jill says to be resentful. Thank you, Jill. I think this is something which bears repeating during tonight's class. These are all things that are obvious. These are all things that are obvious to each and every one of us. Like most obvious things in life, we need to be constantly reminded of them. Things that are usually so obvious and so right in front of our nose are the things that we need to be reminded of again and again and again, over and over. I had a teacher in yeshiva who used to say that inspiration is like Tylenol. It needs to be taken in small doses every 4 to 6 hours. And the idea is that sometimes things that we need to hear over and over again. No one expects you to take this class and have a renewed perspective on life from now or forevermore. And nor do I think that a lot of the ideas that I'm sharing tonight in class, this is the first time you're hearing them. These are powerful ideas that are powerful to think of every day of our life. And the reality is that if we would take 1 day a week or 1 day a month or even 1 day a year on our birthday, perhaps, to contemplate these ideals, we would all be better off. On that note, on the idea of taking time to regularly contemplate things that are obvious, I'm reminded of the famous Hasidic parable about Diamond Island. Anybody here that know the parable about Diamond Island? Could be you've heard it here from us at Chabad before? No? Okay. They tell the story about Shmerel. Every good Hasidic story is about Shmerel. Shmerel is the Yiddish equivalent of John Doe. John Doe in Yiddish is Shmerel. Shmerel was, frankly, I hate to be very rude towards Shmerel, but Shmerel was a good for nothing. Shmerel was the kind of guy who had to be careful whenever he took a shower because everything he touched broke. Every business venture, every opportunity, everything he set out to do just fell apart. And one day, as it happened so many times earlier in life, Shmerel found himself laid off and out of work and just not being able to support his family and feeling like a good for nothing. And Shmerel went home to check his email. And in his email, there was an invitation. There was an email from Diamond Island. There was a formal invitation inviting Shmerel to spend 2 months on Diamond Island. When Shmerel heard about Diamond Island, he thought it was from the same sender who sends you the emails from your rich uncle in Nigeria who passed away and left you a fortune. He thought it was spam, but he had no better options anyway, so he followed up with the email, and he found out that Diamond Island was a legitimate place. It was a real place, and he was really being given an opportunity to go to Diamond Island. So he went to his wife and said, listen, honey, it's not like I have a job here. I got to do something to support our family. I'm going to Diamond Island for 2 months, and hopefully I'll be able to find something to tide us over. And his wife said, sure. And Shmerel gets on a boat, and he sets sail for Diamond Island. And as the boat is approaching the shore, from far off in the water, Shmerel sees a stretch of land that just absolutely glistens in the sunlight. Everything which the sun touches absolutely sparkles. Everything on the island is made out of diamonds. And Shmerel and the rest of the passengers on the ship are overjoyed. They are awestruck. It is literally Diamond Island. The boat reaches the shore and they all climb off the boat, and Shmerel very cautiously walks onto Diamond Island and he steps on the diamonds, and he can't believe this is really happening. And he doesn't know what to do. He's standing on a beach, and instead of sand, there's diamonds, and he reaches down and he scoops up a handful of diamonds and he touches them and he puts them in his mouth, and they're absolutely real, and he starts stuffing them in his pockets. Diamonds, real diamonds. Spends about an hour on the beach, absolutely stuffing his pockets. After about an hour of gathering diamonds, he's hungry. So he walks into town and he finds the most expensive restaurant that he could imagine, one he would never dare walk into in his city. He walks into the restaurant and he pulls out the menu and he says, give me 5 of the most expensive thing on the item. I'm enjoying life. I'm in Diamond Island. Give me all of it, one of everything. The waiters come out and they start overloading his table with delicacies. He's enjoying himself. He's got diamonds. Comes time to pay. And the waiter comes over to him and says, sir, here's your bill. Shmerel says, no problem, sir, not a problem. And he reaches into one pocket and he pulls out a fistful of diamonds and he drops it into the server's hand and he says, here's my payment, keep the change, it's a tip. Thank you for your service. The waiter looks at him like he's lost his mind. And the waiter says, what are these? And Shmerel says, they're diamonds. They're very valuable. The waiter says, sir, on Diamond Island, you can't pay with diamonds. Diamonds aren't a currency. They have no value on our island. They're useless. So Shmerel says, oh, what do you guys pay with? And the waiter says, sir, I'm not sure if you are aware, on our island, currency is schmaltz. Currency is chicken fat. We have no chickens on our island. So obviously chickens are a delicacy that we don't have, and chicken fat is even more rare. We use chicken fat to pay for things on this island. Not diamonds. What you're handing me is garbage. Take it back. I don't want it. You need to pay up with chicken fat. Shmerel says, oh my goodness, where am I supposed to get chicken fat from? So the waiter goes back into the kitchen and he speaks to the manager, and the manager says, okay, if I can't pay, let him work off his debt. Bring him into the kitchen, he'll do some dishes. So Shmerel gets called back into the kitchen and Shmerel starts working in the kitchen. Well, lo and behold, Shmerel finds out that of all the different tasks that he set out to do in life, he finally found one that he was good at. He was great in the kitchen. And he's washing dishes and he's organizing things, and he actually gets a job. He gets hired to work in the kitchen. And after he's paid off his debt to the restaurant, they begin to pay him in schmaltz. And Shmerel begins to acquire schmaltz. Much schmaltz, lots and lots of chicken fat. Beyond that, he's also very talented and begins to get promoted. He becomes a sous chef, then he becomes a head chef. Ultimately, he becomes a restaurant manager. One day he buys the restaurant. He opens up another chain on the other end of the island. He gets a little bit involved in real estate. He has a bunch of different ventures, and Shmerel is rolling in chicken fat. Not literally, but Shmerel has lots and lots of schmaltz, lots and lots of chicken fat. And everything's going great for Shmerel. This is the life he had always envisioned but never actualized. He is wildly successful. Comes the day he gets a letter, he's got to go home in a week. His time on Diamond Island has come to an end. So Shmerel goes to his CPA and he liquidates all his ventures. He cashes out. He sells all his real estate. He sells all his restaurants. And he has the bank bring him barrels and barrels of chicken fat to the shore to put on his ship to go home. You know, when he came here, he was on a ship with a bunch of people. But now he owns so much schmaltz, he needs his own boat to take him and his schmaltz back home. And the boat pulls up at the shore and he loads up the boat with all of his schmaltz. And he set sail to go home, and he's walking on the deck of the boat amongst his barrels of schmaltz, and the stuff reeks to the high heavens. Schmerl doesn't care. This is what aristocrats do. They hang out with their chicken fat. Ah, it's incredible. And he's walking around just relishing in the smell and experience of his chicken fat. And after a few days on the boat, his home island comes into sight. He's headed home. And all of his friends and family are standing there on the shore, and they are greeted by a stench of chicken fat. And they say, Shmerl, what in God's name do you have there? And he says, what do I have here? I'm Shmerl, the richest man in town. I have schmaltz. Say, you have what? Schmaltz, chicken fat. Liquid chicken fat, the best you ever imagined. Straight from the treasury. Look, barrels and barrels of it. They look, and the poor guy's gone mad. They sent him on a vacation. He lost his mind. They said, Shmerl, you went to Diamond Island. Remember diamonds? We sent you to Diamond Island to go collect diamonds. You know how much schmaltz we have here? You know how much chicken fat we have here in town in the shtetl? We have more chicken fat than you know what to do with. We sent you to the island to get diamonds. And Shmerl says, oh yeah, diamonds. Uh-huh. And he reaches his hand into the same suit he was wearing the day when he arrived in Diamond Island. He pulls out 2 diamonds that were left in his coat pocket from that first cluster he had gathered on the beach. He says, oh, diamonds. That sounds about right. Ladies and gentlemen, what is the analogy of Shmerl who goes to Diamond Island? Our souls come down here, and our souls come down into this world to collect diamonds. Precious, precious diamonds. Mitzvahs, things which will give the soul eternal pleasure in the world to come. And they come down into this world. They're born into this world, and they look around. Wow, incredible. Look how many diamonds I have the opportunity to gather here in this world. There's so many of them. And they start gathering up diamonds and doing mitzvahs till somebody comes along to them and says, mitzvahs? That's what you're concerned about? I mean, mitzvahs are cool and all, but here in this world, we care about more important things. We care about chicken fat. We care about cars and homes and money and things of that nature. That's what's important. And the soul goes, oh, yeah? Oh, forget the diamonds then. I'll start worrying about chicken fat. And it gathers up chicken fat and chicken fat and chicken fat until it's time for Shmerl to go back home. And when he comes back on high, he returns with buckets and buckets of chicken fat. And the angels turn to the soul and say, no, we sent you down on a mission into the world to collect diamonds. Share with us the results of your mission. And the soul says, oh, diamonds. I knew I forgot something. I'll tell you, I've got a lot of chicken fat to bring, but diamonds, I don't know so much about. And this is really the ideas that we're discussing tonight here in class. Again, things that are obvious. At a certain point, if Shmerl were to sit down on Diamond Island and go, knock, knock, we're here for diamonds, not for chicken fat, he would have remembered. It would have changed his entire perspective of his time on the island. But he didn't have that time to check in. He didn't have that time to reflect. And ultimately, that's what we hope for as thinking, conscious human beings, is the ability to check in from time to time, to remember the things that are important, to remember the things of value in our life, so that we can remain forever mindful of them and allow that perspective to guide our decision making. Are there any questions before we move on to the next part of class? There's a comment here in the chat. Oh, that was the end of the Life's Too Short stuff. Okay. Anybody want to chime in, either by text or over their audio? Okay. I mentioned earlier that Kira and I, and to a certain extent, I think Joshua and Myra, are from a different generation than many of you taking the class. I don't mean numbers wise. We're not going to start stacking people up. Just, this is a perception. And with that in mind, I want to take a moment to focus on a very interesting Torah perspective that Torah has on a very, very interesting and contemporary issue. Take a look at text 6 on page 220. Taken from the Talmud and the Tractate of Yevamis, page 62, folio B. Rabbi Yehoshua stated, those who were married in their younger decades should nevertheless remarry in their old age. Those who had children while they were young should continue to have children in their older years. So it is stated, sow your seed in the morning and do not withhold your hand in the evening. For you do not know which will prosper, whether this one or that, or whether they will be equally good. Rabbi Akiva stated, Those who studied Torah in their youth should continue to study in their old age. Those who had disciples in their younger years should continue to have disciples in their seniority. So it is stated, so your seed in the morning, etc. Torah has a very, very passionate view on the idea of retirement. Torah is of the opinion that for a productive human being to decide to take an entire stretch of their life, and not just any stretch of their life, but a stretch of their life where they are at the peak of their wisdom, where they are at the peak of life experience, to take that time of life and to say, no, class, I'll sit around, is something which Torah could not speak more passionately about. Beyond the fact that scientifically, retirement increases the likelihood both of a decline in physical health as well as a decline in mental health. Let's read together text 7, taken from the British Telegraph on page 221. Retirement can cause a drastic decline in health, according to a new study. Research by the Institute of Economic Affairs found that both mental and physical health can suffer after retirement. The study, Work Longer, Live Healthier, the relationship between economic activity, health, and government policy, shows there is a small boost in health immediately after retirement, but that over the longer term, there is significant deterioration. It suggests retirement increases the likelihood of suffering from clinical depression by 40% and the chance of having at least one diagnosed physical condition by about 60%. The probability of taking medication for such a condition rises by about 60% as well, according to the findings. People who are retired are 40% less likely than others to describe themselves as being in very good or excellent health. For your own enjoyment, if you take a look on page 222 at figure 6.1, there is a fascinating piece of medical research from the Social Psychiatry and Psychiatric Epidemiology Journal, which really shows in hard numbers the way numbers shoot up for those who describe themselves as working or as retired, which for me was fascinating to go through, because it shows that, interestingly enough, retiring actually increases for a lot of people the likelihood of some real health concerns. Now, obviously, no one is saying, Torah is certainly not suggesting that people are encouraged to work 80-hour work weeks until they are 80 years old. Obviously, there comes a time in life where we're no longer physically capable of doing the things that we were once physically capable of doing when we were in our prime. But it's important to realize, in Torah's perspective, that retirement is an age where one has access to more things than they ever had access to during their lifetime, in terms of wisdom, in many instances, in terms of resources, in terms of people to pass on knowledge to, in terms of people who would be listening to your advice. The benefits of being able to serve and live a productive life, even in one's more advanced age, is something that is very, very powerful. In fact, the Talmud says in the Tractate of Megillah, you can read it in text 8, page 223, if the elders advise you to destruct and the youth to construct, heed the counsel of the elders. Because destruction upon the advice of elders is constructive, and construction upon the advice of youth is destructive. The reality of the situation is that when someone is at a more advanced stage in life, they have the opportunity, they have the gift of being able to volunteer, of being able to mentor, and more importantly, to study Torah. And again, I think this is an idea. We live in a world where mortality is viewed in such a concerning light. And as a result of that, I think society has a pretty dangerous view on the way we view retirement as well. One of my favorite clips that exists on YouTube, I think it really speaks to the idea of thinking on one's feet. Speaking of people from a different generation, sure most of you were around for this in person. I wasn't. But in 1984, when President Reagan was running for re-election, he was running against a much younger man. And his opponent tried to somehow insinuate that perhaps President Reagan was, I don't know how to say this, too old for the job. And the question of age and seniority was addressed at a debate. And the moderator said to President Reagan, Mr. President, your opponent has brought up the concept of age, that it should be a factor in this race. And as you may know, President Reagan famously responded. He turned to the moderator and he said, I will not make age an issue of the campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience. If you have an 80-year-old man running against a 40-year-old man, instead of viewing the 40-year-old man as being so much more spry and having so much more energy than the 80-year-old, perhaps turn the issue on its head. somebody who has been around for longer, who has had the ability to focus on certain things for longer, they have the experience and they have the ability to accomplish things that even those younger than them may not. And I once heard a beautiful idea that retirement in the Jewish thought is an exercise that is very profoundly focused on the word at hand. Retirement is about retiring. It's about taking a car that has put hundreds of thousands of miles on its tires and swapping out the tires for different tires. We don't junk the car. We don't condemn it to a life in the scrap heap and do nothing with it. We retire it. We put a different set of treads on it and allow it to live its fullest version with a new set of tires. Yes, Laura.
I'm looking at the chart on page 222, where it shows that men, when they retire, have a much higher incidence of neurotic disorders and anxiety, depressive disorders, and general anxiety disorders as compared to women who are more balanced. And on a personal note, I think that's because women, even if they haven't worked a part of their life, have always worked, because they've run the home, they've made the meals, they've done the shopping, they've raised the children, and they know how to proportion and allot their time out. Whereas men are just left with, oh, I'm not punching a clock today, or I'm not sitting in the courtroom, or I'm not seeing a patient. And they get completely and totally at a loss for themselves and what to do with their time. So they begin, I think, to imagine some of these incredible neurotic disorders.
I would completely agree with you, Laura. I was fascinated when I saw that science earlier in the week. I will say, and I think it's very fitting today's International Women's Day, that I think the ability that women have to lead a productive life, not necessarily in a 9-to-5 setting, which is, I think, a skill that women have far, far more than men, is something which does put them in good stead when the 9-to-5 routine is something no longer available to them. Women come from a place where they're already set up for that. They've already succeeded in that sort of framework. And so being in that sort of environment for a longer period of time does not scare them to the point that it does scare men. I think that is absolutely profound. And I think you have hit the nail right on the head. Absolutely.
Well, women are great multitaskers.
They are. They are, absolutely. Anybody else want to chime in before we move on to the final section of class, which effectively, as much as it pains me to say it, is the final section of this entire course? Any thoughts from the audience? Okay. In classic Torah study fashion, we are now going to take 5.5 lessons worth and absolutely turn them on their head. We began this class with this course, I should say, with a premise. Death is inevitable. Our mortality is real. It needs to be acknowledged. It needs to be faced head on. We're all going to die at some point. Death is natural. Death is not an end. It's a middle. It's a beginning in a certain sense. We go from the womb to the tomb, and those are both new ideas. And let's face it, we're all going to die, says the Crow Cap. So let's just get with the program. And the sooner we have a healthy attitude about that, the better off we'll be. We're going to challenge that. We're going to challenge the notion that death is absolutely inevitable. Let's read together on text 9a on page 224. From chapter 2 in Genesis. God commanded man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but do not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for on the day that you eat from it, you will certainly die. Spoiler alert. On that same day, for those of you who took Secrets of the Bible with me a few months ago, this will ring familiar. On that same day, literally a number of hours after Adam and Eve received that instruction from God, they ate from the tree of knowledge. Do you know how long Adam went on to live after that incident? 930 years. God said, do not eat from the tree of knowledge. If you do, you will die. And God did not just say, if you do, you will die. God said specifically, for on the day that you do, you will die. And Adam went on to live 930 years. Was God bluffing? Was God making promises that his bank account couldn't cash? What was this? Was God blowing smoke and Adam decided to call God's bluff and test the limits, and indeed he was proven to be right? What we do know is that on that day, on the day that Adam was promised to die, he didn't die, but God told him something else. Let's look at chapter 3, continuation, text 9b. God told Adam on the day that he ate from the tree of knowledge, by the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for you were taken from it. For you are dust, and you will return to dust. On the day that Adam ate from the tree of knowledge, two things happened. One, death became a reality forevermore in the world. But more importantly, on that day, pain and suffering and hard work and toil became human realities. But if the concept of death was introduced on that day, after Adam ate from the tree of knowledge, it stands to be reasoned that earlier that day, before Adam had eaten from the tree of knowledge, death was not yet a global reality. When God had created the world, he had no intention that human beings should die. God, on a certain level, had intended for them to be immortal. And then along came this glitch in the system, which created the concept of death. Not only is this my insinuation based on the verses, there's a verse in Isaiah chapter 25 and text 10 in your book, which says as much. And the verse says as follows: God will eradicate death forever and wipe the tears off every face. Death is so temporary that there will come a day where there will be no more death, and God will eradicate death forever. I spent 5.5 weeks trying to convince you, and I might add, made a pretty convincing argument that death is natural, death isn't so bad. I mean, it's pretty bad for the people we leave behind, but it's not bad for the soul. The body goes back to its place, the soul goes back to its place. It's part of the natural order of things. And now at the very end, I have pulled the wool from your eyes, and I am letting you know that, whatever, death wasn't supposed to be part of the order of things. It just kind of came about, and ultimately one day it will be eradicated. Which is it? Is death part of the reality of the world? Was it always that way? Is it always going to be that way? How indeed should we have a healthy perspective on death? So the mystics, in discussing the situation surrounding the eating from the tree of knowledge, share something profound. The eating of the tree of knowledge, and we talked a little bit about this for those of you who are my students at Secrets of the Bible Lesson 1, the eating from the tree of knowledge created the idea of sin. Before the idea of sin, the body and soul of every created being were absolutely in sync with one another. By definition, this meant the body was selfless, which I know is something funny for us to hear now. The body was selfless. The body was created to be a tool for the soul. The only desire the body had in and of itself was to do the will of God. The body had no ego, and there was absolutely no conflict of interest between the body and the soul. This is the way God created the world, and frankly, this is the way God intended for the world to be forever and ever. What happens after Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge? Suddenly the body became a conscious self. It had an ego. It was now separate from the soul. It had its own desires. The body is now the source of all selfish desires known to this created being. The body has the potential to go against God's will. And ultimately, that's what happens. We now have that struggle between body and soul. Let's see this idea expressed in the text from our mystics, text 11. The condition of death was introduced to the world through the sin of the tree of knowledge. The condition of death that was introduced to the world through the sin of the tree of knowledge was a natural consequence of the very sin itself. To explain, life is associated exclusively with holiness. Unholiness, on the other hand, is death. As a result of the sin of the tree of knowledge, unholiness, spiritual death, mingled with the human identity, from which the condition of physical death is a natural, eventual consequence. Ladies and gentlemen, what is death? If you had to take death and express it in a single sentence, what happens when anything experiences death? Death is the separation of the mortal from the immortal. We are a fusion of a mortal being, our body, and an immortal component, our soul. When they are fused together, we call that life. When they are separated, we call that death. Explains the Jewish mystics. At the moment of the sin of the tree of knowledge, the world experienced spiritual death. At that moment, for the very first time, there was an unsinking, there was a separation of mortal and immortal. What happened with the tree of knowledge? The tree of knowledge was created to be an expression of God's will, and the tree of knowledge was used for sin. This introduced the idea of spiritual death into this world. What is the natural byproduct of spiritual death being introduced into this world? Sadly, physical death is right behind it. At the first moment that the world experiences spiritual death, detachment, separation between mortal and immortal, physical death is right behind it and is a natural reaction of that experience. Thus, it stands to be reasoned, if physical death was a reaction and a byproduct of spiritual death, what happens if we eradicate spiritual death? What happens if we create a syncing and a synchronization of every mortal and immortal in this world? What would be the natural byproduct of that experience? Physical death would also cease to exist. Let's dwell on this for a second. Let's talk about what it means to fuse body and soul in every facet of creation and to separate body and soul. What is something's body? Let's not speak about humans for a second. It's easy to get hung up on humans. Take, for example, food. What is the body of food? The body of food is the thing's physical or superficial dimension. When I look at a tomato, what is the body of the tomato? The body of the tomato is the skin and the flesh on the inside, and it's red. It looks a certain way. It feels a certain way. It tastes a certain way. That is the body of the tomato. What is the soul of the tomato? The soul of the tomato is its purpose. What was the tomato created to do? The tomato was created by God to nourish. When I bite into a juicy tomato, I get nourishment. I feel healthier. I feel fuller. I'm alive. Something positive happens to me through biting into the tomato. What happens if I take a tomato and throw it at the wall? I've ruined its body, it gets smushed, but beyond that, I've cut off its soul. It's no longer able to achieve its purpose. The reason why we use the term soul when referring to the purpose, let's say, of a vegetable is because it is something you can't see. If you cut open the tomato, you cannot see the power of nourishment. You'll see the pits, you'll see the seeds. You won't see the nourishing force that exists inside the vegetable. Everything which was created in this world has a body and a soul. The moment something experiences a detachment between body and soul, where it exists in its superficial dimension, but it is no longer able to accomplish its true purpose from God. For example, when the tree of knowledge is used to defy God's explicit instructions, the tree of knowledge goes through spiritual death. And the natural byproduct of a world which has the existence of spiritual death is physical death. Ultimately, the food's physical properties are the taste, smell, appearance, and texture, and the food's soul is the ability to sustain, nourish, and provide energy. As human beings, if we consider our mission to rectify spiritual death, when we value something not for its external properties, so we are not brought on to desire a certain something because it looks good, because it tastes good for whatever reason. We have a connection to that thing specifically because that thing, that piece of food, piece of clothing, piece of machinery, whatever it is, exists to allow us to serve God in a more productive fashion. That is how we rectify spiritual death. We do not see it for its body, we see it for its soul. And when we see it for its soul, we create a linkage, we create a fusion between its body and soul. When we use something out for the ultimate purpose for which it exists, that is the rectification of spiritual death. And the rectification of spiritual death in every particular instance is the greatest precursor to the eradication of physical death. When we go around our world, and each of us in our own slice of heaven is able to use out everything which we have in our world for the ultimate purpose for which it exists, we have rectified another instance of spiritual death, and we bring the world one step closer to a time when spiritual death will no longer exist. And if spiritual death no longer exists, then ultimately we come to the time closer and closer when physical death will no longer exist. With that in mind, I want to conclude the course with two fascinating insights. We talked earlier in this course about the notion of Maimonides' 13 principles of faith. Maimonides believes that there are certain ideas that are so fundamental that if we had to take the entire Jewish philosophy and boil it down to a bunch of to a bunch of talking points, to a bunch of bullet points, these would be the 13 principles of faith. One of them is, we talked about this in the cremation class, is the idea of Techias HaMesim, the idea of the resurrection of the dead. The resurrection of the dead is something which is profoundly important to the Jewish faith. Take a look at text 12 from Maimonides in his introduction to chapter 10 of Sanhedrin, where he lists these 13 principles of faith. Page 227. The resurrection of the dead is a foundation of the Torah of Moses. One cannot maintain a connection to the Jewish religion and the Jewish nation without this belief. You want to tell me to believe in God? I'll believe in God. You want to tell me to believe in reward and punishment? I'll believe in reward and punishment. You want to tell me to believe in the coming of the Mashiach to the end of days? I'll believe in that. Why is believing in the notion of the resurrection of the dead something so fundamental to our faith system? What is it about the resurrection of the dead that is considered to be A1 on the priority list and makes it onto this very exclusive list of the 13 principles of faith? What is it about the resurrection of the dead? Explains Jewish mysticism. What will bring about the resurrection of the dead? The resurrection of the dead will be brought on by the ultimate elimination of spiritual death. When the entire concept of death will cease to exist from this world in every form and fashion, when the separation between body and soul will cease to exist, when all bodies and souls are fused together, that will mean that evil has been eradicated from the world. And at that point, everyone who has died throughout our history for all eternity will all get back up and rise again, because it will have been revealed that their death was just a temporary symptom. The fact that they had to go through a death process was just because the world was imperfect at that point of time. And when the world is able to reach the point of perfection, the side effect that they had to suffer will be nullified, and nullified retroactively. And the entire concept of death as we know it will completely and totally cease to exist. Explain the mystics, this is why the idea of the resurrection of the dead is so profoundly important to the Jewish faith. Because the resurrection of the dead speaks to our ability to each and every one of us fulfill and discharge our divine mission in this world and create a world where death doesn't exist anymore, neither spiritual death and by extension physical death. Believing in the concept of the resurrection of the dead is believing in the fact that we all have the ability to discharge our mission, and there will come a day when humanity will succeed at discharging that mission, when humanity will actually get it done and eradicate that disconnect from the face of the earth and create that fusion between body and soul in every facet of existence in this world. Let's see some questions. Are we resurrected? Are we resurrected as a body or as a soul? If souls are recycled, then less beings will be recycled. Okay, hang on a second. As we talked about clearly in class number 2, when we are resurrected, we are absolutely resurrected as a walking around body with all of our bodily limbs. We are resurrected in our fullest human form. And as we talked about last week, we are not recycled. Each one of us is an offshoot of a spark of a different soul. And as such, we all have our very own soul to wear when one day we will be resurrected. So we will all be resurrected in our bodies with our specific bodies and the specific sparks of our soul that were sent down in this world to live in our body. They will all be fused together and resurrected when that important time comes. Laura, does that answer your question? Good. Anybody else? To recap, resurrection of the dead is the ultimate actualization of the resyncing of body and soul, the ultimate purpose of creation. What is thought to have been the purpose of the tree of knowledge if Adam and Eve had never eaten of it? Asked Dr. Spector. Wonderful question. The tree of knowledge was meant to be sustained for a time when God saw fit to it that we should live in an immortal fashion forever and ever. And at that time, they were encouraged to eat of the tree of knowledge. We talked about this in great length in our first course of the year in Secrets of the Bible. It was meant to be there more for a test, but it did have a purpose, assuming that test would have been succeeded. Ultimately, this is all hypothetical at this point because the test was, I guess, let's say, failed in spectacular fashion. Does that work, Dr. Spector? Good. Cheryl, go ahead.
Okay. I think it was last time we talked about when that part of the soul or that spark of the soul is reincarnated to again try to meet its purpose or its mission and
Yes.
fails over several times. It can become an animal or an inanimate object. So,
Short term, though.
but is that to say that my dog was a failure? And because my dog has such a sweet soul.
Right. So as we talked about, excellent question, Cheryl. As we talked about last week, when we speak about the idea of a human soul having to take a turn in an inhuman experience, that soul does not become the sustaining life force of that item because a human soul can never sustain an animal or an inanimate object or anything of the sort. So that animal or inanimate object has its own soul, which is its life force, which is giving it sustenance, which is its and its exclusively. In addition to that, at times there might be another fragment of human soul that is there for the ride for a short-term rehabilitation process for it to get its program together and sort itself out when it goes back into a human body. But the sustaining existence of the animal or the inanimate object is not a tortured human soul. No.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. All righty, ladies and gentlemen, it has come the time for us to read the final text of this course. Let us read together text 13 on page 228, which is actually a part of a letter from the Rebbe to someone who had experienced death and loss in their family. We had cited part of this letter in lesson 3. Let us conclude it now. A kernel of consolation is captured in the traditional hallowed statement of consolation that has been used to comfort mourners by tens of generations of our nation's communities that follow the Torah tradition. May the omnipresent console you among the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. At first glance, the association of these two concepts, Jerusalem's destruction and a personal loss, is perplexing. The reality, however, is that we have perfect confidence that God will rebuild the ruins of Zion and Jerusalem. He will gather the dispersed remnants of Israel from the ends of the earth through our righteous Mashiach, and he will bring them in gladness to witness the joy of Zion and Jerusalem. We are equally confident. The same is true with regard to our personal bereavement. God will fulfill his promise that those that dwell in dust shall wake and joyfully sing. Great indeed will be the happiness and rejoicing then, when all will meet together after the resurrection of the dead, when death will no longer be something that we ever have to grapple with, that evil will never be something that we ever have to grapple with, that negativity and adversity will never be a reality that we ever have to grapple with. May it take place speedily in our days. Are there any questions before we take a look at tonight's key points? All right, then, without any further ado.
Lesson 6. Life is short-ish. 1. Our exploration of death and the afterlife through the Torah's lens reduces our fear and unease, allowing us to consider our mortality without panic. 2. Some believe that because we eventually die, nothing is overly important. But Judaism insists that because we die, each moment of life is of supreme importance and should be devoted to matters of eternal relevance. Considering our mortality motivates us to focus on what really matters. 3. Our natural illusion of immortality spurs us to consider time as dispensable. We care more about wasted money than wasted time. Reflecting on life's finitude replaces this illusion with an urgency to take advantage of each moment. 4. We are designed to be productive beings. Retirement is not a Jewish concept. As our brute powers wane, we should transition to mentoring, sharing our wisdom and experience, etc. 5. Before the sin of the tree of knowledge, the body was the soul's extension, and their desires were synced. Sin destroyed that dynamic, causing spiritual death, the misalignment of body and soul. Physical death is an outgrowth of spiritual death. 6. We rectify spiritual death by realigning everything with its purpose, ignoring the superficial layers of a thing, its body, and instead focusing on its inner truth and purpose, soul. Upon completing this rectification, physical death will no longer be part of the human condition.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a great segue to our next topic. Our next JLI course is entitled This Can Happen, an optimistic view for thinking about the future, really kind of delving into the very, very mysterious ideas of Mashiach, a world to come, a perfect world, whatever that means. We touched on that a little bit tonight, but we're going to be touching on that at great length. I believe it begins at the end of April. I'm not sure exactly which day, but you know that you'll certainly hear information about it in the coming days and weeks. Either Tuesday or Wednesday, we'll be sending you a recording of tonight's class. Thank you very, very much for joining with us on this journey. It has been an absolute honor and pleasure to share these conversations and these ideas with you all. Please feel free to reach out if you feel there was something not addressed in this course. Feel free to stay in touch. It was an absolute pleasure spending this time with you. And I wish you all long, happy, and healthy years of not contemplating your mortality, of living a wonderful, wonderful life to the extent of your fulfillment. And we look forward to studying together, hopefully very, very soon. Thank you for joining and have a wonderful, wonderful evening. And as we say before Pesach, a Chag Kasher V'Sameach, a kosher and happy Passover with the fulfillment of all good for you. All the best, ladies and gentlemen, and have a good night.
Thank you.